Hi there, good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Some familiar faces here in the room, scanning across. So many of you will know one of us or both of us, or have some dealings with our organisation, whether it be across compensation, retirement, benefits, or one of the other myriad of things that we do. But today is about innovation. So today we wanted to share with you some of our latest research. This is forward-looking research, and really focused on the direction of travel for employers globally. So the research is focused on 4,000 employers across 88 markets, and what we're hoping to do during the session is really give you an indication to where organisations are headed, some of the key themes that emerged, and maybe where there are some regional variations as well. Got a clicker. Okay. Thanks. So we've aggregated the research that we've done over the last few years, and we've really started to look and understand what makes a modern reward and benefits programme, not just in the UK, but globally. And we found that it comes across as 5 dimensions. But before I get started, I just want a quick show of hands. Of your employers, of your organisations, how many of you have gone through significant change in the last 10 years? And how many of you changed your benefits substantially in the last 10 years? Okay. Kind of as expected, yeah. Benefits can remain this kind of static thing that don't really change unless legislation changes. But actually what we find here is that the most progressive organisations use a model not too dissimilar to this. And I'll talk you through it. So portfolio, this is fundamentally what you offer. What's the breadth of your reward and benefits offering, and how does it align to you guys as an organisation? Financing is fundamentally how you pay for it. Is it insured? Is it self-insured? Is it on payroll, off payroll? Is it an allowance, or otherwise? Talent experience. This is thinking about how it interacts and how your people interact with it and how it aligns to your employee value proposition. Administration and operations, probably the least sexy thing we're going to talk about today, but it's the engine room. This is how you manage reward and benefits globally and make it work seamlessly with HRIS, with payroll, and with other internal interfaces. And analytics, insights, and reporting. The adage of you can't manage what you don't measure. So here, we'll talk about what organisations are doing to really understand and get under the depth, really, of are their benefits effective, how they're monitoring them and managing them, and more importantly, how they're evolving them as well. So the survey we're talking about here today is the 2019 Benefit Trends Survey. It took place during the summer of this year, and 4,300 employers across 88 markets participated. To give you an idea of rough scale, that's 22 million employees, 2.1 million in the UK, and 437 UK domiciled employers. What stands out to us here? Well, the one that stood out to me initially was this percentage of payroll spent on benefits. And you'll see in our region, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, it's the lowest. So you see LATAM at 20%, North America at 23%, and Asia Pac at 16%. What can we deduce from this? Is it social security programs in Europe are pretty advanced, therefore the proportion of payroll spent on benefits is slightly lower? Perhaps. Or maybe it's indicative of the direction of travel. When the government is willing to do less and putting more onus on employers, is it fair to say that employers will be footing the bill for more benefits in the future? Also, we've got things like medical inflation. The 2019 figures and 2020 figures suggest global medical inflation running around 6.8%. Mark.
Thanks, James. So just really wanted to look through the different dimensions and explore a little bit about what that means, giving some examples. But I think back to James's point, the breadth of data that we have here is obviously pretty broad, so we're just trying to give a bit of a snapshot today. But starting off with portfolio, and I think often when you talk about portfolio, people immediately think about stocks and shares and their own investments. And I think it's probably, not necessarily a bad way to think about, as organisations, what we offer as part of our portfolio. I think there's been an absolute deep desire by organisations to constantly look to expand what's offered, to provide new choices, to constantly play to what the market's saying, but also what legislation is driving, but often without necessarily stepping back to examine, is it relevant? Do we get value? Does it meet the needs of our people? And most importantly, does it actually help our organisation achieve what we want to? You know, that desire to actually benchmark, understand what organisations are doing, and also make sure that there's a feeling of being on the right track and aligned to actually get value from spend. If you click on James. And interestingly, looking at the survey, for every participant, they completed a process to actually develop a scorecard that looked at both their key objectives, but also then what evidence they had around taking action against those objectives and how that measured up. And you can see this figure on the top left there. Only 6% actually came across as highly effective in all areas of benefit strategy, playing across all those different dimensions that we looked at. But I think what's more telling is that that statistic that 49% of employers saying they understand workforce requirements, but yet then why are only 36% tailoring the portfolio to meet the needs of employees? And I think certainly over time, I'm sure we've all had that experience of if you ask people what they want, they will always say they want more. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing and doesn't necessarily mean we get value from it. But I think probably the most damning thing that came out of this research that we were quite surprised at was this figure in the bottom right-hand corner. Only 1 in 6 people, and bearing in mind most of these are reward or benefits professionals around the world, would strongly recommend their company as a place to work based entirely on the benefits package. So on one hand, I think that's a little disturbing, but the other actually, it means there's great opportunities to continue to tailor and develop and improve that approach around portfolio. But least of all, I think when we think about what we offer and obviously increasing the breadth and increasing the spend, it really starts to put an as ever laser focus on financing and actually how much it costs us and what we do with it. Here we can see from a geographical perspective how the top priorities varied. And unsurprisingly, I think there's a lot of consistency, albeit slightly different ordering, and inevitably, as we'd expect, well-being is right up there as a priority. I'll come on to touch a little bit more on well-being a bit later on in the session, but interestingly followed by enhancing work policies, and I'm sure we've already seen from a lot of the sessions so far today, when we're thinking about well-being, when we're thinking about inclusion and diversity, ensuring there's an alignment between policy and then actually benefit design and how we deliver it is becoming ever more important. But I think the other area that we're really seeing that growth is this, market norms and crucially, employee wants and needs. Because actually that I think is really rising up the agenda as a priority for organisations because there's a fundamental acceptance now that it needs to be aligned. Otherwise, we're questioning where do we get value and actually is there any value from spend on certain areas.
Thanks, Mark. So financing is, unsurprisingly, almost the #1 priority, whether it's operating costs or managing the underlying benefit risks we see across the globe. Employers increasingly are telling us they're feeling the pinch, but also they're looking to understand where are we generating value. As employers become more global and operate in numerous territories, looking at things like economies of scale is no longer the preserve of just the largest organisations. So we think back a few years, the emergence and the role of captive financing, for instance, and multinational pooling was really just for very, very large employers. Now we're finding that come down to different tiers. And actually, you don't need to be very, very large to take advantage of some of these things, such as global underwriting. So when we look on a global basis, financing can take many different shapes and forms. I think what's critical to understand here is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And fundamentally, financing comes down to engaging with your internal stakeholders. So what's the risk management approach? What's the finance approach? And getting stakeholders together to look not just on an in-country level, but actually trying to either regionalise it or globalise it and stand back and say, where are our opportunities to consolidate things, where it makes sense to?
Talent experience, and unfortunately this wasn't me in Hollywood, but it's probably one of the #1 themes we're seeing here today. If you look at half the providers out there, we look at half the sessions. But yet I think I've been in this industry probably 17, 18 years now, and without exception, I think the challenge has always been we'll spend 15, 20% of payroll, but less than 1% communicating and engaging. And I don't think that's unique to benefits. That's about, as it says, the talent experience. It's about the employee deal. It's about really focusing on our #1 asset, which for most organisations now more than ever is human capital. But therefore, actually that need more than ever is about how we tailor, how we ensure it's relevant, how we package it in context of everything else we're doing, be it around learning and development, being around career progression, be it around work choices and work-life balance. And actually, I think it's reassuring that now more than ever this focus is moving to engagement and focus on that. As we can see, and certainly reassuringly, 83% of employers have put this, as we project forwards over the next 3 years, as a top priority focus area. I think that's incredibly encouraging, and it's also globally consistent in terms of how we're looking at that as a priority. And I think the other piece that goes hand in glove with that is also technology. And whilst I think lots of organisations will have technology platforms, lots of organisations will work with enterprise software such as SuccessFactors, Workday, etc. It's an expectation now that we can really create a much more consumer-led experience for our employees around how they interact with benefits, how they interact with their whole reward offering, and how they understand the organisation. Many of you will have flex platforms, many of you will have other self-service platforms, but actually, it's becoming much more omnipresent, and I'd say almost a hygiene factor now. And certainly the UK being a much more developed market than others, we've seen huge demand over a long time, but actually particularly across certain key areas in Europe, Latin America and Asia in particular, more than ever is that ability for people to interact on demand and actually when they want to, but in a way that actually is much aligned with how we all interact with consumers using smartphones, devices, etc.
Thanks, Mark. So when it comes to administration and operations, I mentioned this is kind of the engine room of how benefits fundamentally work. When we looked at the survey participants, you can see here going from left to right, and this comes out time and time again when we talk to organisations, that data management and security, particularly in a post-GDPR world, is incredibly important. Now, I was with a bank yesterday and they said their number one priority when they're looking at benefits globally is to how do we get our hands around the governance piece here? And particularly if you work in a regulated organisation, whether it be finance or banking, particularly, you'll see that this is on the boardroom agenda. How do we manage our data? Clearly, when we're looking at benefits and reward, we're dealing with very sensitive data most often. So then how do we find and manage the number of vendors that we're using to reduce the risk of data breaches? We then go here and look towards the right-hand side. We're seeing that approximately half or up to 58% of employers globally are looking to integrate benefits information within HR data, trying to create one version of the truth. To Mark's point about that kind of group-wide software thinking, SuccessFactors and the like, bringing that together and looking at benefits concurrently and identifying opportunities to get more data, which comes on to our point in a moment as well. And then this point here about a cloud-based solution for online benefits, Mark mentioned it earlier. In the UK, all you've got to do is look outside and see how many technology providers there are in the UK market. So perhaps we're starting from a more advanced state than many of the other countries throughout the world where flexible benefits is in its infancy or doesn't exist. And that's where you see the difference between the UK and the global piece there. So I said earlier, when it comes to analytics and insights, this is around measuring and thinking about, it's no longer just about ROI, but it's actually on value and investment as well, and thinking what are the other things that we get by our benefits spend. So what were the top 3 priorities for employers? I think if we start on the left-hand side here around benchmarking, unsurprisingly, Mark and I are here talking from Willis Towers Watson about benchmarking. Why wouldn't we, right? But fundamentally, benchmarking is only one piece of this, and that's the external view. Many of you will benchmark, if not all of you will benchmark, your compensation, and you have a very well-defined philosophy about where variable comp is, where fixed comp is, and what you see there. But that's only one part of it. The second part of it is also Mark's earlier point, listening to employee wants and needs. Just because your competitors or your perceived competitors offer something doesn't necessarily mean you should. It's just a useful external benchmark. So that internal piece and employee listening is critical. And the third point is culture. Do these things align to your cultural values as a business? And I think the interesting piece around William Hill, and they were talking about kind of their culture and their organisation and what would work for them may not work for others as well. That's why relying on benchmarking solely is a rather blunt instrument, actually. We move towards the right-hand side here. We see budgeting and planning and looking ahead and saying, okay, so I've got an ageing workforce or I'm in some high-cost locations. How can we look forward and see what the most progressive employers are doing and saying, well, if our roadmap over the next 5 years is to grow our headcount to support our business operations, have we got a view on what our most expensive countries are? And how do we stratify that? because benefits will be a part of that. If we look at that 14% of payroll, there'll be a difference if I'm putting someone in Turkey and setting up a team there than there will in Latin America, for instance, or in Eastern Europe. So getting a handle on the analytics, insights and reporting from a benefits perspective, again, will support those strategic priorities and boardroom objectives when it's coming to growth and putting people in key locations. And this is what we're seeing employers across the next 3 years looking to do. And the final piece here around analysis of employee requirements, this can take various forms. Most of you will do employee surveys of some type. Many of those will have questions around reward and benefits provision in there as well. But actually, that's only one stream. What about things like exit interviews? How are we aggregating data around absence? What are you doing around virtual focus groups, for instance, for remote workers? So actually doing more employee listening broadly, not just once a year. Mark.
Thanks, James. And as you can see, this was James before he started the Willis Towers Watson Employee Wellbeing Programme. No, I mean, joking aside, look, wellbeing, it's a huge drive behind every organisation now. You know, I don't think you can actually have a conversation around the benefits landscape and reward now without actually thinking about wellbeing. You know, as we touched on in the previous session, the 4 pillars I think are very well established. But actually what's been quite remarkable, I think, has been the growth from being more of a term that sort of meant 100 things to 100 people to now having much greater consistency and clarity, not just in the UK, but on a global basis. You know, I think those 4 strands are established to varying degrees depending on countries and culture, and I think that cultural piece around wellbeing is fundamental to how organisations are able to actually define their own philosophy and also then embed it in a way that is aligned, both in terms of geographical locations, but also actually the leadership endorsements they're going to get. If we think from that global perspective, and here, you know, we can see we've got the sort of 4 pillars. I think inevitably, you know, physical well-being is probably the most established by virtue of the health landscape, of screenings, of you know, the disability landscape, occupational health, health and safety. I think all organisations are very much on a track around that and are progressing. I think likewise, when we think about financial well-being, heavily driven by each country's pensions landscape, also the tuition and other areas that employees have to pay for. You know, I think of a recent seminar I was at where actually in a country that fundamentally there was very little state provision, and that was the thing that's in the back of everyone's mind they're worrying about, but employers didn't have a duty of care that was mandated to address that, so actually it was going to be very slow to develop. Likewise, emotional well-being. You know, again, we have heard ad infinitum about the importance. There's been an explosion, I think, in the last 2 years in terms of certainly the local markets we have here of awareness, of that culture creation around it's okay not to be okay. But actually that is in stark contrast here relative to, you know, I was in Moscow at an event 6 weeks ago, and, you know, one of the clients there who was native and said, fundamentally, we have a problem getting people to smile in public, let alone talk about some of their true mental health issues. And so therefore, even if you're looking at this global approach and how we're delivering it, we have to really understand those local subtleties, and actually to get that endorsement, the message has to be appropriate to the market. And then the last area, we'd say social well-being, which I think is probably the loosest in terms of definition and the most heavily driven by culture. But actually, when we looked at the data, we could see it typically was the larger, more global organisations who are really starting to grapple with this more effectively to actually define what it meant. But I think overall incredibly reassuring that this is such an important area of focus for all employers.
Thanks, Mark. Diversity and inclusion. So when we ran this survey in 2017, this didn't feature in the top 10 issues for employers. Fast forward 2 years, and you'll see that it really is an issue for employers. So 60% of employers are looking to incorporate inclusion and diversity into their benefits and programme design. This is a UK statistic. This varies across the globe. But what does it tell us? Well, I think in a post-gender pay gap world, if we're thinking in the UK more specifically, we've seen accelerated states where employers are saying children and parenthood isn't the preserve of mothers alone. And the only way to close the gender pay gap is by looking at it on a level playing field. And you'll see outside, you know, there's real movement here amongst women's health, fertility, and we're likely to see that increase in the future too. But we're also seeing the most progressive employers, just like William Hill did earlier, talk about maternity, paternity, shared parental leave. And we think about some of the most progressive employers there, Standard Life Aberdeen. We've seen Zurich recently announce time off for IVF and fertility too. And I think there's quite a lot to be learned there, that benefits doesn't exist in this vacuum whereby they're just physical things or insurance products or pensions. Actually, this is about people's lives and about people bringing their whole selves to work. And if we can help and support them, that's likely to have a greater impact on broader issues like engagement and retention of employees too.
So, I appreciate that has been a pretty rapid run through of a huge amount of data, but we just wanted to really help give a little bit of clarity in terms of the breadth that's available here, the number of markets, and ultimately, I think, probably the one thing I've heard from so many clients who have participated is it's just reassuring and helpful to understand where we sit relative from a global perspective, local perspective, to understand how we score. Because importantly, I think when you're looking at programs and how you move from where you are to where you want to be, looking across these 5 dimensions and looking consistently, regardless of whether it's a health screening program or part of well-being or part of how you build it into your I&D process, is just giving you an objective framework to drive that. So we're here on our stand today. Obviously, we're happy to help in terms of sharing more data and information about specific countries, locations. And if people do want to participate to get their own personalised scorecard, then by all means, please come and talk to us, as that's certainly possible. Conscious I've overrun, and I'm probably going to be very unpopular, so we probably have no time for questions, but no, I've got a no. So, but anyway, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.